would like to introduce Amy Potter, who will be moderating the panel on buying and selling IPv4 addresses. Amy is a senior technical business developer for Amazon, responsible for IPv4 address acquisition. This is Amy's second time presenting at NANOG. Amy's first talk at NANOG was called How to Navigate IPv4 Space in a Post-Runout World at NANOG 68 in Dallas in the year 2016. Welcome back to NANOG, Amy. Please introduce us to your panelists.
Hi, everyone. We are here on the 10-year anniversary of IPv6 World Launch Day to talk about the IPv4 market. We've got a great panel here with panelists that each play a different role within the IPv4 market. So let's start out with introductions. John, would you like to start?
Sure. I'm John Sweeting, the Chief Customer Officer at the American Registry for Internet Numbers, and I get a little bit involved in transfers.
Billy?
I'm Bill Sylvester. I run Adrax Marketplace for IPv4. Have been around for a long time in the industry, both in domain names and IP numbers.
Hi, I'm Tina Morris. I run IP strategy at AWS.
Hi, and I'm Chris Drumgoole. I'm the Chief Operating Officer at DXC Technology. And relevant to this conversation before this, I was the Global CIO for General Electric.
Okay, cool. I'd like to start out by addressing the elephant in the room, and that's IPv6. Tina, Chris, you have both participated in the IPv4 market in the past. Does your participation in the market indicate a lack of commitment to IPv6? Have your organizations deployed IPv6? Tina, let's start with you.
Okay, so AWS is extremely committed to IPv6. It takes a while to get there, right? We have to convert every service and do everything. We cannot single thread our efforts just into v4. That's not sustainable. It's not possible. We look at it like we're solving the v4 problem for our customers until they're ready to go to v6 naturally and natively and on by default. In fact, we even encourage our sellers, when we're dealing with them, to take the funds and revamp their network and even launch v6 as well, because we want them to take that opportunity with that large sum of cash and go do something really good with it that makes sure they don't have any technical debt going forward.
Yeah, no, I think, I'm kind of the one that doesn't belong on the stage because we're an enterprise versus being in the business. So I think probably similar to a lot of the companies you work for, it's a bit of a different mess. So I would say from a philosophical point of view, we absolutely believe in 6. It's obviously the future. It's the way the world is going to. But just like everybody else who works at a big company, the technical team and the technology team understanding that doesn't always match everybody else who needs to pay for it understanding that. And I think that's where the kind of rubber meets the road. So my experience both at GE and at DXC has been actually, as Tina just alluded to, is using the opportunity to leverage our IPv4 space to enable the transition to v6. So that's exactly what we think about it, is how do we kind of take these asset that most companies don't even realize they have, don't know they have. Frankly, most people outside of the technical team don't even understand the value of or even what it does for a living, and then translate that into funding that we can then use to execute the transformation to v6. Now, is that easier said than done? Yes. So in the case of, I don't want to speak for my previous company, but a little bit GE or DXC, it's a journey, and you typically selling the address space gives you the first step in that journey to begin to isolate yourself and to begin the process, kind of a slow transformation. But it does become the rare, I would say, kind of unicorn rare in corporate America or anywhere in the world corporate, where kind of you can actually have a technology that pays for itself, and not in the BSE, oh, I have a great ROI, look how much it paid for itself. Like, no, cash money. Like, we did this and you got a check. So that's been our experience with it, and kind of that's why we're committed to making that transformation to v6.
Great. And John, you're in a really interesting position at the RIR because you have visibility into the address holdings of transfer market participants both before and after the transfers. what are you seeing at the RIR level? Does it look like the people that are participating in this market have just abandoned the idea of IPv6 altogether, or do they sort of have both resources going on at once?
Yeah, great question. We've seen over time, year over year, approximately 30% of our source organizations that are selling IPv4, about 30% of them have V6 and have had V6. A part of that is because a lot of the transfers are people that have IPv4 and they're not using it, and they're actually selling the V4, and then once they sell it all, their organization goes away. So it's probably a higher percentage that actually are deploying V6 along at the same time they're selling the V4. And then on the recipient side, it runs about 50% of them, the organizations buying IPv4 have IPv6, with about 20% of that 50% getting V6 after they have purchased V4. So I don't think that it just shows they're running from V6 at all.
Okay, cool. So we've touched a little bit on this idea of sellers using the proceeds from the sale of their excess IPv4 addresses to fund some improvements in their network, potentially deploy IPv6. I'd like to dig into that a little bit further. Chris, when an organization is going through that process, they're planning to sell off their space to use those funds for some work within their network. Oftentimes, the process of doing that requires going through some sort of renumbering, which is something that sometimes engineers can have a little bit of anxiety about what they're going to find when they open up the hood there. What kind of advice can you provide to other organizations that are thinking about going through that process to get comfortable to sort of take the first steps forward?
Well, first of all, stay calm. I would say that's the the first reaction. I think, listen, it's interesting. I obviously sit on the business side now, but I grew up as a network person, so I have a perspective for it. But I was sharing this story before we came into the panel. When I started at GE, my first day, and I was in technology, I got my laptop and it had a public address inside the company, and you're kind of like, how's this work? And then once we kind of decided we were going to sell it, our own technical team, who I love, some of them are actually here, we had Class A3, nicknamed the process of selling it the 3-pocalypse, because they were so nervous about what was going to happen if we sold it. So again, I start with stay calm. Like, we've all figured out how to run network technology, and like I alluded to before, it's the one time when you have a cash check coming in to run the process. So you're not going to the CFO and asking her for money. You're going and telling her how much you're going to give her. And that's a very different conversation, because you're saying, hey, by the way, I'm going to get you a check for X dollars. And by the way, I'm keeping a little bit, and you're going to get a new network out of it. Now, I think, and that's fundamental. I've approached that at 3 different companies now with my partners here, and it's worked very well. But I think, to the kind of technical aspect of it, it's also the one time we focused a lot on V6 for the first half of the conversation. Yes, that's important, but it's not only where it ends, right? It gives you the opportunity to kind of erase your technical debt for years. All the things like publicly addressed laptops that everybody in the company knows doesn't make sense, but no one really has the time, money, energy, effort, or opportunity cost to fix. It gives you that license. Like, again, I really can't understate how powerful it is to be showing up with a check for an asset that your average board of directors literally doesn't even understand what it is when you're describing it to them. And so it really does give you an opportunity to get a new network. You basically get a new network and you get to be a hero if you're sitting on the enterprise side. That oversimplifies it a lot. There's a ton of work that goes into that. But if you approach it that way, I think it's a really easy way to facilitate a transaction. My advice would be, understand what it costs to do the work before you even talk about the transaction, because just kind of, let's all use human nature, speak in net numbers from day one. The amount of money you can get is X, and X already includes the cost of redoing your network. Don't sell them on X and then convince why you have to go do the network after.
That's very good advice.
Yeah, and Billy, you're in kind of an interesting role as you run a marketplace. You have to get sellers to come participate in that. And I'm sure you've had some similar conversations when it comes to some level of work that they have to do to clear off the space before they're ready to sell it. What kind of advice can you give for getting buy-in from the higher up parts of the organization there?
So from our perspective, we encounter a lot of different levels within the organization. When we're dealing with the C-suite and the CFO, that one's very easy because they always want money. And so it's very easy to say, hi, you're going to get all of this money and your expenses are not going to be that much against this money. And normally it starts the conversation that says, you mean I got this for free and now I can sell it for something that's worth a lot of money or multiple commas? And
Do you have any more?
they're like, can you look and see if we have any more of these? As we start to work, though, within deep technical organizations, you have a very different perspective in that most engineers start off with a fear of, oh my gosh, we're going to need this. And that sort of struggles with that whole, we're moving to IPv6, but we need to keep all of our v4. From our perspective, we don't see that v4 and v6 compete. We see that v4 is going to be around for certain legacy networks for a long time, even as we get critical mass within v6. And we need to continue to work towards that. And within engineering organizations, there's usually projects that are underfunded. And I probably everyone in here has had some sort of project where your manager, your boss, the CFO said, oh, we don't have money for that this year. We'll try again next year. And within those years, it's very easy to take what's called budget offsets. And within those budget offsets, you can receive money to offset the expense within the same year. And as Chris sort of alluded to, the idea of showing up with real numbers and real statistics, and this is going to cost us specifically this much money, and based off of that, we're going to find revenue that's going to come in, and that revenue is going to have no cost other than our internal manpower and additional hardware we're going to do. And so it's been very successful for non-financial folks to basically say, okay, this is a way that we're going to find money to fund some of these projects. And we've had great success in finding that type of support from the C-suite.
So we're talking here about, going in with this sales pitch within your org of, we're going to be able to bring in this amount of money for these assets. How do you figure out what is this amount of money? The IP address market is incredibly opaque. It's difficult to figure out how much an IP address is going to cost at any given point in time. When you're dealing with a new buyer, a new seller that's not familiar with the market, how do you help them figure out what the appropriate value for an IP address is at that given moment? I'm sorry, Billy.
Okay. So pricing is very, very challenging. It's very easy to go online and search and find a wide variety of pricing. And you have to take a lot of that skeptically, because what you find is that may have been a transaction for a different size block. That may have been an encumbered block, meaning there was some sort of work or other issues. You may have had custody issues. From that perspective, ultimately it's worth what one party is willing to pay for it and another party is willing to sell it for. And then the connection of those two parties equals a transaction. We often provide guidance for buyers to look at their business models and to understand the revenue that's derived from an individual IP address that can be stacked on top of that, build that into their business model and understand some sort of return on investment within that. That identifies what they're able to afford. That doesn't necessarily identify what they want to spend. And everyone wants to spend as little as possible from a buy side. As sellers are looking at the same problem, they often go online and say, oh, I saw this number on a website, or I saw this number come across in an email. And, at the end of the day, it's ultimately, what are you willing to sell that for? In certain cases, if you're unwilling to sell it at a lower price, but you're more willing to sell it at a higher price, those are some of the economics and market dynamics that come into play, as we look at the overall market and how they determine pricing. And there are several other industries that you see similar type things. Certain organizations will have to spend a certain amount of money to clean up their network, to repurpose their network, to develop their networks, next-gen networks. And that is the baseline for what they need to spend to get it out there. And if it's not worth the effort and the time and the energy and what they might consider to be a distraction, they're going to demand higher prices.
Could I just add to that for a second? Because I think as someone who's pitched this to more than one board for pretty material numbers, that is the second question you're going to get after you get over the what the hell's an IP address. The next question is going to be everybody in that room who has a fiduciary responsibility to their shareholders asking you how to understand the market. And at the risk of sounding campy, it does come down to trust a little bit and doing business with people that you can establish a relationship with. It is, the transactions themselves aren't complicated. It's actually amazing how short the forms are that you actually do the transaction on. But you're entering into a marriage, make no mistake, because it's going to take you some time to clean things up. It's going to take the new person time to use them. And you're going to be friends or enemies for the next several years. And you got to factor that into your pricing model. So, sometimes someone might have a slightly better or slightly worse terms, but I would just really caution to understand that it is not a, hey, this was great, we're done. Unless you have the luxury of you're not using anything, then by all means call 12 people and get the best price. But if you're in if you're anyone who's not in that situation, you really need to trust the person you're selling them to or buying them from, depending on your side of the table, and understanding that you're going to have a working relationship for years. And I would really factor that into the price, while at the same time, 1000% maintaining your responsibility to your shareholders or your owners to get the best value for their asset. But don't discount doing business with someone who's you trust and someone who's reputable in the space.
Yeah, absolutely. Tina, you've bought an IP address or two. What are your thoughts on figuring out pricing?
Yeah, much of what Billy and Chris have already alluded to, but it's much like the housing market. Just because one house sold in your county for $1 million doesn't mean your house is worth $1 million. They have different prices based on the time of year, the need of the organization, the cleanliness of the space, the timeline of delivery. There are so many factors that come into it. And the sellers that haven't done the research and are far removed from the market often see the highest price they can find, and they multiply that by their number of IPs. And that's absolutely what they expect. And there's a lot of, speculation pricing out there and published that isn't necessarily based on fact. So it can be really tricky. We talk to a number of brokers, a number of individuals and conferences, and there's just so much word of mouth with this because there isn't the documentation to show pricing. So we kind of compile all that information and work together to figure that out. We have we have some brokers we work with. Whenever we're talking to brokers, we always look at the all-inclusive price, including any fees, anything that they have, rather than the per IP price, because for us, it's the same. That's the amount of money my organization has to pay to receive the addresses. And so we look at the all-inclusive pricing when comparing everything. But yeah, it's take the prices you find with a grain of salt. They're not, do your research, talk to people who've done sales, talk, get referrals before you commit to anything, or tell your leadership that you can get them $85 an IP, which I have seen people offer. Not legitimate offers, but they've tried to get sellers at that price, and to my knowledge, that's not available. So I wouldn't want to walk into my leadership with a number that's so inflated that I can't possibly produce an offer to match.
So something that we're seeing a bit in the market as prices go up is we're seeing an increase in the number of bad actors and attempts at fraud. Tina, when you're buying space, what kind of steps do you go through to confirm that even the individual you're talking to has the rights to sell the space they're trying to sell you?
You look at whether the seller we're speaking with has the rights at the RAR. You look at the lineage of the space. Have they owned it since, or not owned, sorry. Has it been registered to them since the initiation of the account? Or has it changed hands a few times? Can they prove their status as owner? Because there is some risk. As we talked about earlier, there could be problems with that space after you take it. Somebody can already be using it, a customer that maybe is impacted when your organization advertises the block. And for AWS, we are customer obsessed. If I start using a block and it's breaking my customer, I have to take action. That means I suddenly can't use that until we resolve the issue on one side or the other. And that can get very, very ugly. So reputation matters quite a bit, making sure you're doing the deal with the right organization, that they actually have full rights, not just access to an account to make the transfer.
And John, at the RARs, I'm sure you see a lot of really interesting things happening there as people attempt to do transfers under a variety of different situations. What kind of advice can you give about coming prepared and avoiding potential fraudulent transactions?
Yeah, I think the best advice, if you're a source organization that's looking to transfer your IPv4, is to actually review your records at the RIR, whether it's Aaron or any of the other RIRs, and ensure that they're registered to the company that you're actually named at that point in time, and that you're actually registered to lawfully do business. A lot of times what we see is there's been mergers and acquisitions, 4, 5, or 6 of them. Those are the really difficult ones because they'll have their asset purchase agreement for maybe 2 of them, but they can't find it for the 3rd one. So it can take a lot of time. So the best advice I can give to organizations looking to source out their IPv4 is to work with Aaron and make sure that you have the proper documentation and that we get those resources into the current organization, that you're the legal successor to whoever was originally issued that space.
May I add one thing to that? Just
Sure.
speaking for John for a moment. Aaron is not going to take your space away if you have this conversation. This isn't a secret. They're not evil trying to do this. They actually want to facilitate this and keep registration records as accurate as possible.
Yeah, we work really, really hard to try to make it happen. Sometimes it just can't. Sometimes there are just bad actors out there that are trying to put a claim on a /16, a legacy space that they have no right to, but they know a little bit of history about it and they try to put together some sort. So we really do dig deep, and those can take quite a while. But in the end, our analysts take a lot of time, but if you feel like you're not getting anywhere, then it's the best thing to do is just escalate it up to either Lisa Lydell, who's the director of RSD, or directly to me, and we will work with you. We will figure out something, what kind of legal documents that we can get produced by you to make us. The whole thing we're doing is we're actually trying to protect the people that are purchasing the space as well as Aaron and the community, because Aaron has a legal responsibility to make sure we don't give somebody's 6/16 away to somebody else. So we won't just take your space away. If we can't help you prove that it's yours, then we'll move on and you'll move on.
And Billy, you've handled a lot of transfers in your day. What kind of advice can you give for preparing to make sure that you have the documents that John's referring to here?
So we always start at the state level and in North America, and are working to build that story from inception. And that starts with an organization that was founded in the 1800s or maybe the early 1900s. Those companies were merged, those companies were divested, and we follow the trail. In certain cases, we can only follow the publicly available information. And that's most of the time where we end up in good discussions with Aaron or other registries, is identifying that documentation that's perhaps not public, because contrary to popular belief, there's not a lot of divestiture docs prior to maybe 2010 or 2015 that explicitly say this IP address goes along with this. Normally it comes in a form of all the business operations were transferred, or all of the network resources were transferred, and that included IP addresses at the time. So, I mean, for us, though, we like to follow it from inception all the way to where we are today, documenting as much publicly available information. There's great resources out there through the registries, but it's also helpful to have all that documentation together ahead of time, because when the registry comes back and asks for additional information, states or other legal entities might take a lot of time. Especially most large organizations struggle to get internal documentation. So you have to start with a patient process and put all of that together. And it's usually helpful if you can get it all together up front and then go and ask the registry, versus what I refer to as death by 1,000 paper cuts, where you go back and forth with each individual request, and then you have some period of time, a week, a month, 6 months, and that's the way that you keep these transactions to a point that's manageable, and you're not spending time. And that also increases the likelihood that transactions will succeed, because the last thing you want to spend is a year working on a transaction and only to have that fall apart because somebody can't find a piece of paper justifying a source organization.
And John, what kind of advice do you have for preparing on the recipient side or the buyer?
Yeah, so if you're looking to buy or to receive resources through the transfer market, the best advice I can give you is to get your pre-approval first. Come in, give us the the justifications, the how much space you need. I think you can go out to like 5 years. We're going to need this much space in the next 5 years, so that you can buy a block size that you're not going to have to go out to the transfer market, every 6 months or something. You can come in and say, here's our business plan for the next 5 years. We're planning to grow our customer base by 100%. So we need 100% more IPs than we have today, and we will give you that pre-approval, and then you're sitting there, and that it can be chopped up. You can use the pre-approval. If you're pre-approved for a /16, you can go out and buy a /18, and as you need it, you can. And we'll just subtract it from your pre-approval, and you can use that. Those are good for, I think, 2 years before you have to come back in and renew it.
All right, let's talk a little bit about planning in terms of the appropriate amount of time that you should expect the whole process to take. I'm going to go back to Tina. You've done a few of these. What kind of expectations should people have going into the process, starting from the point when they're either first thinking about selling or first thinking about buying?
So it's really hard to answer. It varies. If the space is vacant today, your company's registered properly with Aaron, you have a good relationship with them, your executive officer that's signing the contracts is available, we can, get to contract quite quickly. A transfer could take a week, 2 weeks, something like that. And then payment, whether you've done escrow or wire after, is immediately after. So the whole thing could be wrapped up reasonably. I think 3 weeks is a possibility. That is the extremely positive case. Extremely positive. Yeah. But most deals, even when they happen that fast, have been talked about for a long, long time. And it's rare that somebody just decides to sell and then it happens that fast. So the larger ones I've done, some have taken 2 or 3 years to get to a contract, to get to the first contract. But typically, once we get to the first contract, I usually expect about probably 2 months start to finish, for the whole process. From talking the first red lines, going through contracts, negotiating that, getting those signed, getting everything in place. It's not super fast.
One thing that we see sometimes as a part of this process is sometimes buyers can be concerned about the reputation of the block. Can you talk, Tina, a little bit about what do you look at in terms of, do you look at block listings?
Yeah.
What are you checking out?
So we look at everything that's publicly available. We don't have any secret sauce that looks at, inside your network. So we can't see if you're using it internally. But we look at the block lists. We look at the RADB, the other IRRs, the routing entries, all of that. We have a very lovely tool that somebody on my staff built that has really saved so much time, but that looks at everything. And we do factor that into the price offered. We do factor that into the consideration. And oftentimes we tell a seller that they didn't know they were using part of their space. Sometimes they find out from us that they're still using their blocks. And so we do this reporting very early and let them know that they need to get it off of block lists, that there's, some, like the Russia block list was a big problem for a while because nobody could get space off of it. So if it was on that list, it was just a no-go, things like that. And so we give them basically a report. I think Adrex does something similar for their customers, and that's their homework to go figure out. They're like, oh, we didn't know these 24s were being advertised. Nobody's supposed to be using that. It's like, okay, so somebody in your org is, and you should know about that before you give them away.
There's also registry cleanup that goes in with that as well. Yeah. Cleaning up in-adders, cleaning up old routing objects, cleaning up RUDB.
Yeah.
It's a process that we call preparing for sale. And that puts the space so that it's as clean as it can be when and going into transfers and going through the Aaron process and making sure that Aaron doesn't have a lot of headaches for dealing with sort of orphaned objects or other details.
Right. Yeah. And one thing you need to be careful, especially when you're doing inter-RIR transfers from RIPE or APNIC or LACNIC, you have to really look at the history of that block, as Tina mentioned. We've had a few people that have purchased blocks through RIPE, and they purchased those blocks because they got them cheaper than the other blocks that were being offered to them, and it ended up like that they were registered to a Russian company that no banks in the U.S. would let those IPs into their access their systems, and the ISP happened to do almost all financial customers. Oh. So they bought that block and they couldn't do anything with it. They had to, unfortunately, Aaron couldn't do anything for them. They had to go out and purchase another block.
Mm-hmm.
I think I'd be remiss if I didn't touch on the fact that at least within the Aaron region, there is one alternative option to buying, and that's the wait list with Aaron. John, do you want to talk a little bit about how the wait list works?
Yeah, so the wait list, in the beginning, it was pretty much you could get any size block off it that you could qualify for under policy. So in the first couple of years of the wait list, we did have several /16s that were filled, and even a 15. We found some fraudulent activity because there was a 12-month hold on. You couldn't transfer. Couldn't get it off the wait list, and then you had to hold it for a year. We found most of the big blocks were sold exactly 12 and a half months after they got them off the wait list. So the board put a hold on it and redid it. And so now today you cannot have more than you can have a /20 plus a little bit more, like a 24 or 22. But if you have more than a /20, you can't apply. You can only receive up to a /22 at a time, and you have to wait 90 days after your first fulfillment to go back to put in another application. So it ends up, we we do our distributions quarterly. So it ends up if you don't have any space and you start out, you could get a 22, sit out a quarter and be back on the list and get a 22. However, we're running very, very low on inventory that we have gotten in and cleaned up for the wait list. And I believe we're almost up to 500 on the wait list now. And on the last distribution, we only filled like 50 organizations out of 200 plus that were on the wait list. Up to that time, for the last 2 years, we had been completely filling every request each quarter. But that has stopped, and it's not gonna pick up again. There's no more. We're really out. There is a few larger blocks that we'll clean up over the next 6 months to a year, and but it's not going to be enough to ever completely fulfill that wait list at one distribution. So it's still a viable solution, but only if you can wait.
A longer period of time. All right, cool. Let's go through and just give everyone one last chance. Do you think that what sort of advice do you have for anyone thinking of participating in the market that maybe we haven't touched on here? Let's start with Chris.
I think we've covered almost all. I didn't jump in before, but I would just say my advice would be if you're an enterprise or a big company that's selling, you saw everybody kind of chuckling about the transaction times because they've been all over the place. Don't underestimate how long it's going to take you to convince everybody in your own company to do it first. Mm-hmm. In my experience, that's been longer than any of the external transactions. Everybody in this room knows how to do it. No one in your company does. So give yourself a lot of time, energy, and effort to give that to transaction to happen, and then the rest will kind of come easier, would be my 2 cents of advice.
Yeah, I would go with trusted, and who you're dealing with is really important in this. If you don't know your buyer, if you're doing a direct deal with an entity that you have a long-standing business relationship with, that's very low risk. If you're going out and selling to somebody that you have no ties to, that the risk goes up. Protect your organization, use escrow if you're in those kind of situations. Once you update your file at Aaron and people see the name changes start to come through and all that, there's a number of brokers that are watching those transactions, or I should say individuals wanting to be brokers that are watching those those transactions. And they will then contact you a lot if they're not already. And you've just put a sign on your door like saying, I'm ready, I'm selling. And they will come up with some really interesting stories to get you to talk to them. As with any business you would do, get a referral, find out who they've worked with. I'm not here to say who's good and who's bad, but there's only a handful we do business with. In general, we're dealing with bigger blocks. That puts us into a different category. But get a referral. Don't just say, oh, they told me they could get the highest price, so I'm going to work with them. Because there's a lot of fraud.
Oftentimes they can't.
Oh, and one other pet peeve of mine, I will pick on Aaron a little bit. So every registry has a list of IP address facilitators. These are not endorsed by the registry. There's no such thing as an Aaron endorsed facilitator, a RIPE endorsed facilitator. They have signed an agreement and they've paid a fee to be on the list. That's all. So be careful with those lists. Don't take those as a referral. It's not Yelp of brokers or something. It's
a service that we offer to the community to list facilitators that want to be listed.
Correct.
And that's all it is. It's just a list of possible facilitators you can contact. But as Tina said, they come in all shapes and sizes, and you really need to get a referral. We can't refer any facilitators. We don't, and we won't. We can give you names of organizations that have completed transfers, but you can really find that as well. But that's as much as we can do. We won't even discuss facilitators with anyone.
Just ask around. I've inherited transactions that were underway, And there's even as a seller, there's a really big difference between a good broker and a bad broker. Like even after the deal is done and the price is set, there's a really big difference.
Yeah.
Billy, would you like to respond?
I would say right now there's definitely constraints going on in the marketplace. So plan early and plan often. Don't wait or delay, in the sense that too often people show up and say, hi, I've got a little bit of budget. I'd like to buy some space. Oh, by the way, I need to have it done by December 31st, which is 4 days away. Those types of things are unrealistic. To the extent many organizations are struggling to spend the time on a lot of their long-term planning, especially when everyone started using the internet more during COVID. There were some organizations that were caught seeing an increase in traffic that was unexpected, and that put them into crisis mode. And so just by staying ahead of everything and always be looking at that sort of capacity issue, and plan early, because you may not be able to find what you're looking for in a short time frame across the board.
All right. Why don't we open this up to some questions from all of y'all? I think Marlene's going to come up and.
Oh,
Here's your chance to ask these.
there's no questions. It's good, really easy topics. There's no questions at all.
So from the online audience in the Q&A forum, we have a question from Carl Morin. Aren't organizations forced to return unused IPs by errand policies, looking at legacy allocations to public entities? I think that's a question to
I'm
me.
sorry, I did not.
Sure. Aren't questions forced to return unused IPs by errand policies is the question.
No, absolutely not. We will allow you to return space, but we even have a requirement that your CEO or COO, a C-level officer, signs and notarizes an affidavit saying that they know what they're doing and they want to return the space. They don't wish to participate in the transfer market and they want to return that space. Without it, we won't even take space back from you.
Okay, we seem to not have any questions from the live audience yet. Let's
One in the back.
Hi, Tim Timrawi. I'm asking, where do you see the industry?
Sorry,
in
could
5
you
years?
state your name and affiliation,
Tim
please?
Timrawi. I'm asking, where do you see the industry in 5 years? Where do you see the market going in 5 years from now?
No, Patrick.
We
We all hope, but
we have a little bit of time here. Do the three of you want to
I
go
was gonna
through?
say, do we all want to take a stab at that?
I'm not qualified. to
All
say,
right,
but
Billy, what do you think? Where's
All right,
the market in
I'll
5
take that one.
years?
So the market in 5 years, what you're finding is over time, prices will increase, but only to a point. At some point, technology will have to replace that. Many have hypothesized that's going to force the move to V6. I would argue that V4 is going to continue to grow as organizations supporting V4. V6 will be on its own trajectory, as we've already seen. But what you're seeing right now is that once a block transfers, that block isn't typically going to transfer again.
Right.
What we may find is that in the future, as people are migrating to V6, certain elements of V4 will be available, and that will continue to provide additional inventory for organizations who aren't able to turn off or shut down their V4 networks.
And just to build on that, I think there's a great effort to find efficiencies for V4 in your network and use V6 wherever you can to grow. And I think we'll see more and more of that, where organizations aren't necessarily obtaining additional space. They're learning to use what they have better and exactly where they have to have V4. I think both will run in parallel for quite a while, and V4 will probably maintain value for quite a while. But there will be a point that organizations stop acquiring space, I would expect.
Printers usually can run on RFC 1918 space or Net 10 or 192, 168. So something to look into if you're not doing that already.
Hard-coded mainframes are another story.
Very true.
We have a comment from the Q&A portion stating from Dan Megorian, not like MIT and Stanford sitting on /8s that had to get done. I'm not really sure what he wanted to
Make a point.
Make point.
point. From the live audience.
Omar Akintoy. I am from AWS. I have a question. So Amy, you touched on bad actors and inflating of the marketplace. Do you mind elaborating on what a bad actor looks like or inflating the marketplace?
Sure, I can elaborate on that. So there are well, these addresses have value, and there are people out there that will try and extract some of that value. Sometimes it can be an organization that, or an individual even. They'll look up some stale space in the RIRs that haven't been touched for a long time. The point of contacts haven't been updated. And they will try to either pretend to be a broker representing that space and will try and sell that to someone when they have absolutely no rights to do that. Sometimes there have been orgs that have started up a new company in the name of an old company that space is registered to try and pretend that they're the same organization. All sorts of creative ways people have found to try to sell something that was not theirs to sell.
If a facilitator asks you to pay them and have no relationship whatsoever with the seller, run.
Anytime there's a lot of money involved. That was actually one thing that came up before. I would also recommend, even if you're not in the market of buying and selling, to the extent that any of your companies are doing M&A, you should really stick your nose in it. Because typically the lawyers and the other folks doing M&A don't understand the subject matter. And I've actually been on the side of it where someone accidentally sells a block or words something in such a way that they don't even realize they're doing, and the block and then the recipient who maybe does and maybe is a little bit bad acting suddenly tries to claim rights, and next thing you know, you're in a legal fight. So even if you're not planning or buying or selling, I would just recommend you have a responsibility to your company. If you know about M&A going on that in any way involves an IT system, you should just stick your nose in it as someone who knows the space and understands what's going on to help protect your own company and make sure you don't accidentally do something that your organization will regret years later, because I've seen it happen.
Yeah, I'd just like to add one thing from the Aaron point of view. There was a time when you could reclaim your POC by having an email sent to the email address of the POC. And a lot of, as Amy was saying, a lot of people found domains that were gone and address space that wasn't being used, and they registered the domain name, and they set up a mailbox, and they reclaimed those POCs, and they've been using that space for a while. They come in and they now are trying to transfer it. We catch that because there's a lot more requirements for transferring the space than just claiming it. But there was a time when if you were going to be in the spamming business, you needed a whole lot of address space, and you would do anything you could to find it. So
Yeah.
There's a book here clearly waiting to be written. And this shouldn't be turning into a how-to.
Yeah, so fun tip, if you're afraid that someone is trying to sell you space under that circumstance, you can compare the date that company was started to the date that they received the addresses with the RIR. The company should have existed before they...
And fun thing, if you come across one of these individuals, you can report them to Aaron.
yes, you can.
And they can take some action.
I think there's one in the back.
We do have a question from the online audience as well. Hi, this is from Cyril Laviere. Hi, has the IP market changed since the recent events in Ukraine started?
I haven't seen any substantial change in the North American market, and I haven't seen a real substantial change from that.
There's a little interesting change we just noticed in the past 2 quarters. For the first 4 years or so of inter-RIR transfers, a lot more space was going out of the ARIN region into the RIPE and the AP-NIC region. We think that was due to we had so much legacy space that wasn't being used, and those people rushed to go ahead and fill the market in all 3 RIRs, ARIN, RIPE, and AP-NIC. And it's that low-hanging fruit is drying up in the ARIN region. But the bigger companies in the ARIN region that are still needing space, they are going out to the other regions and transferring in large blocks. Last quarter, we had a 14 and 5/16s come into the ARIN region, and we had never had a quarter where we had more than like a total of a /16 coming in from inter-RIR transfers. So we have noticed that change in trend in the market.
I would say the only thing that we've noticed is on the sanction front is just have to be diligent about the organizations that you're working with, especially when it comes to do not trade lists, foreign corrupt practice. There are folks out there in the world that will try to represent that they're legal for North American companies to do business with, when in fact they're representing one of these sanctioned entities, and you need to be very careful on that front.
State your name and affiliation, please.
Sure. Dan Mahoney, ISC. Wondering if you've seen any sort of market for leasing IP addresses for a couple of years for organizations that don't want to lose their permanent thing.
Tina, do you want to address that?
I've been known to rant about leasing. So leasing to me is a bit flawed. If you're leasing to your customers, again, the relationship matters, the trust matters. If you're leasing to your customers, that's a choice. That's, that can be a good business model. Leasing in general, most organizations that are trying to lease their space want to hold on to it until IPv4 hits peak price so they can sell it then and make money until then. That's a really big gamble. Any legitimate user is going to lease the space for 5 to 10 years, and you may miss the bubble altogether to sell the space. And any organization that's willing to go month to month or year to year, and I'm being very general right now, but oftentimes there's a reason for that. They are spam operators. They're doing something nefarious. And that block will then be tainted by the usage being used for that, and the whole block, including your services that you're running on the other part of that aggregate, can now be on block lists and experience issues. So my advice to anybody that wants to go down that road is definitely split anything you're going to list into a org that's completely separate from your primary business, so that if it does impact, you don't feel it and your customers don't go down.
Thank you. I have one other minor cautionary tale. If you're doing DNSSEC on your IP addresses, ARIN has a little bit of a flaw where they will split your /16 into a /17 and assign your DS record all the way down to all your individual /24s. That really needs to be fixed. Ask me how I know.
Okay, we have another question from Ron Da Silva. Can you talk about the revocation discussions happening in the AFRINIC region and how that might be impacting the transfer market globally?
The AFRINIC region?
What's going on in AFRINIC?
No mas. No.
Yeah, I think we should say.
I cannot answer.
I cannot answer either.
Okay, moving on. Okay, so here was the full comment / question from Dan Megorian. We have we have a /16 that could not be that could be resold due to NAT, leaving a bunch of 24s and a 19 for remaining apps need real addresses. The problems are huge amount of thankless work working with internal users, find all the legacy apps still using it, some of which source code is lost, and having started that, any problems that happen are your fault when break old boxes cranking away in corner that no one owns anymore. The second problem is the network and application folks that do all the work with users don't even necessarily get the money from reselling addresses. The CIO would take the money and give it to some other project, not like MIT and Stanford sitting on /8s that had to get done. Not sure.
Well, you wanna go first?
Well, I'll start with the couple problems there. For one, your network, when you're waiting, you're afraid to touch your network for fear of breaking it. You're not a confident network operator, right? Like this is an opportunity to really go and clean up your network, and this is an opportunity of a huge magnitude. The second half, we do see this a lot, especially purchasing space, where the people that have to do the work to free up IPs don't benefit at all from the work. The money goes into a larger pot. They get nothing. They don't get their projects funded. They're still, struggling. One of the things you can facilitate when you do some of these transactions, I won't even say it has to be direct because a good facilitator can make this happen as well, is figure out a way to get some of the funds directed into your projects. So one option we've talked about is, paying a third party that can broker equipment and contracting services and things like that out of the fee right off the top that we're paying for the addresses. And then the remainder after your project's done goes into the big pot. So get creative with your deals.
Yeah, I would just add, obviously, listen, my opinion's biased because in that example, I am the CIO, right? I'm the person he's complaining about, not specifically, but I'll just be very blunt. And I've been a hands-on network operator and I've been a CIO. You know what solves every one of those problems? Cash. It does. It's just, let's not beat around the bush. Okay, so we're all pissed off because we have to work harder because our company got a check. Well, at the risk of sounding like the capitalistic CIO, that's why we all get a paycheck. So I think but if I'm on a more constructive bent to answer that question is, that's why you got to get in front of it. Don't let it happen to you. Don't let a broker call a board member and convince them that they have an asset before you're involved in the conversation. If you have it, recognize it and bring it forward. And suddenly you're not the person who's not getting funding, you're the person showing up with a check. And those are two very different conversations internally. So take some agency, be aggressive.
Yep.
No one in your company outside of the people in this room or some of the smartest network operators in the world know how this stuff works. So take it to them before someone else does. And then all those problems go away.
Absolutely.
Great. State your name and affiliation, please.
Hey, I'm Brian Fields. I'm with Nokia, but I really have kind of two things I'll touch on. One, you had said leasing was kind of a bad idea. If the opportunity comes up and you're familiar with the person leasing, I found it's actually works out pretty well, but you have to know the person doing the leasing. It's how I've taken my little bit of IP space that I have personally, and I don't have to pay the iron bill anymore and get a little bit of money out of it and get to still use most of it. The second question I have, and maybe off topic from what you guys deal with, but for organizations now that have IP space, and now somebody technical is coming to the various C-level executives and saying, hey, we have this IP space, we can sell it, we can make money. And maybe you can answer, once you guys do have this space internally, is that then something like that your accounting guys have to track as an asset and all that? How does that work? I'm curious if you guys have dealt with that as a problem.
The V4, or was that for the V6 tracking or
Well, for like
V4,
for
the
V4
purchasing?
space. Well, not even that. It's just you're an organization that has V4 space, and do you now find yourselves having to like track that as an asset on the books now?
Yes,
Okay.
very much so. It's amortized just like any hardware or anything you would buy. Mhm.
Okay.
And one comment response to your lease question, I agree. If you have a relationship, it can be a very mutually beneficial situation. But one caution, I was approaching it as somebody that was providing the space to lease out. If you're leasing space, you are also at risk if you don't have a trust relationship, because the organization that owns the space could decide to sell it at any moment. And if they have no other assets, if somebody's just holding a block and they have no other assets and they chose to sell it, you have no say. All of a sudden your networks could be off. So trust is super important.
Yeah, what I was saying regarding leasing was like, I have a block from Aaron.
Yeah.
I pay the Aaron fees. We pay the Aaron fees, and I basically use it for messing around, a little bit of colo here and there kind of stuff. And through some serendipitous thing, I was able to help somebody and get them online. They said, we'd like to lease this /24 from you. I did a little agreement with them, and now my Aaron fees get paid by somebody else. So it worked out very nicely.
Nice.
Great.
I'd just like to point out that at Aaron now, with the fee harmonization at the beginning of the year, all our block, everything is an allocation. So even former end users that are now service members can actually do reassignments in the database. So if you're leasing it to somebody and you want to show that that's who's using that space, you can reassign it in the Aaron data and it'll show up in who is.
And you want to do that for legal warrants and everything else, of all the abuse.
Yeah.
Yeah, we swept it and it's all taken care of.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Great.
Good. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you all again for the discussion and time spent with us today.
Great.